All right, so we started talking a little bit about shade. I know some of you all were talking about the shade structure that was over in that grazing area when you were setting up your paddocks. So we'll talk a little bit more about some options for shade and the importance of shade in a grazing system. Shade is absolutely critical in grazing systems, especially if we think about our spring and summer times of the year, and really even into fall. And honestly, here in Kentucky, at least since I have been back in the state since 2020, we've got times in the winter when cattle experience heat stress with their heavy winter coats, and we get this kind of break in the weather where it warms up. So making sure that they've got access to shade is really important. Heat stress is a major impact not only on animal productivity, but also animal welfare, and making sure that we are providing a comfortable and optimal environment for our cattle or small ruminants. So we'll go over some different options for that. So one of the things that really makes shade so important is this idea that cattle have a thermal neutral zone. We do too. It's different than ours. And so do small ruminants. So that's this area of temperature where they do not have to exert any energy or calories to either cool themselves off or keep themselves warm. When we get into either cold stress or heat stress, this gold line here is their maintenance requirement. So that's the amount of energy or nutrition that they require just to stay alive. And so it's flatlined here in the thermoneutral zone, and when we get outside of that, maintenance energy requirements go up. Gain will go down. Feed intake will also go down when we get into a heat stress situation. They're not going to be out grazing. They're going to be trying to find a pond, a mud hole, or hopefully sitting under a shade tree and maybe not standing in those ponds. But either way, heat stress, it's really more than just temperature. And this is where heat stress gets us in Kentucky and really in the southeast. It is this idea that is a combination of temperature and humidity that creates the temperature-humidity index. And then we can kind of classify that into either no stress, alert, which is where we need to be aware of the potential of heat stress, and if we can change our day around, maybe work those cattle earlier in the morning or leave them alone, probably need to do that. Danger, we really can have some losses, especially if we've got any kind of like stalker calves, high-risk calves, animals that may be already ill, that can certainly stress them out to a point that makes those symptoms way worse, and we can actually look at death, and then emergency. And at that point, we don't work cattle if we are in this emergency area of heat stress. We aren't going to try to transport them. Certainly not during the day. We can try to transport them late at night. In that danger area, we can work cattle first thing in the morning. I know our crew is in the habit, if we've got to work cattle in the summer, they're there right at daylight. And we'll get started super early and try to get that work done before things get too out of hand. So this was looking at daily maximum temperature humidity index, and this was from Caldwell County, so where Princeton is in western Kentucky last year. And so you can see that even over here in April, we had days that got up into that emergency area. The red box is emergency. And then when we get out here into June and July, pretty much the whole time of June and July, at some point we were in that danger or emergency area. And then all the way into September, we were still having some pretty high levels. So I need to actually take this out and update it and track it on into the fall to show you guys how that kind of comes back down eventually. But yeah, we were dealing with a lot of heat stress. This was last year, and honestly, I don't think there was anything exceptionally hot about last year. It's kind of just normal for us. So our cattle do deal with heat stress. Recognizing heat stress in livestock is really important as well. So the first stage of it is elevated breathing. Maybe they're restless, so you're going to spend more time standing and trying to dissipate that heat. And then as we kind of move through here and get more severity, you're going to have open mouth breathing. More of the animals are going to be affected. The whole group is probably going to be affected. And really, when we get down into this area, this is cases where we don't have any shade for those animals, or, for example, feedlot cattle, where they might be on dirt or concrete and have limited shade. That's really where we get into this very, very severe heat stress. But we can avoid a lot of this by having some type of shade available to those cattle, especially during those hottest times of the day. So that increased respiration, that takes energy, right? That's causing energy. So that's energy now diverted away from growth to support just being able to breathe and try to dissipate that heat. They don't want to eat, so they don't feel like eating. They're not out grazing. That's decreased weight gain. We know that there's decreased milk production. There's a reduction in fertility, both from the male and female side. We know that bulls that get heat stressed, it can wipe out their sperm for an entire cycle. And that's just by raising that temperature by 1 degree, internal temperature by 1 degree. So then we see decreased pregnancy rates. So that's not only just something that's happening at the cellular level, causing damage, but also their behavior changes as well, because again, they're not feeling like going out and breeding cows. Things that can exacerbate heat stress, I kind of already touched on this, but having them in an earthen or concrete lot versus pasture, we know that causes a difference in heat stress. The biggie here is overnight cooling. We can get those daytime highs, but as long as it gets down cool enough in the overnight hours where they can recover and dissipate some of that heat, then they're kind of ready to go again for the next day. But if they don't get a chance to recover overnight, and then we have 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row of really, really hot temperatures, then that heat stress kind of grows on itself, and that's really where we start to see a problem. This is where the fescue toxicosis comes back in, because if we think about fescue toxicosis, those veins are constricted, right? We talked about that yesterday. Those veins don't just magically open up overnight. So those animals still have a harder time dissipating that heat load, even if it does get cooler overnight. So it makes it, that's why those animals are so much more susceptible to heat stress problems. Feed timing. This is a big one for ruminant animals, especially cattle, because their rumens are so big. And if we think about cattle and feeding them, when the rumen bugs and microbes go to digesting, that process creates heat. And that heat really occurs about 4 to 5 hours after we fed them. So if we're in the habit of going out and feeding our cattle, if we've got to feed a little supplement, maybe to some growing animals or things like that, if we're in the habit of going out there and doing that in the morning, when's that heat going to hit them? Midday, hottest part of the day, right? So one of the things that I always recommend, and we do this a lot, we are a full fall calving system at the research station. When it gets really hot, we switch from supplementing some of our heifers, especially are the ones that we have around in the summer that are maybe a little more high maintenance. We go to feeding them in the evening. So the last thing the guys do before they go home is go feed the heifers. That way, that peak heat of digestion is occurring in the cooler part of the day. Fly control is another one, and I won't get into specifics, but doing our best to try to control fly populations, because that avoidance behaviors, them trying to swap flies off of each other and off of themselves, flipping tails and things like that, that is all taking energy, right? That's all movement, and it's making them move around. Cattle age and weight. So really, really young calves, that's fall calving system. I hate it when we have calves born a little bit early in that late July, early August time frame. That's usually bad news. It's pretty challenging on them. But really old animals as well can be more susceptible to heat stress. Weight, overly conditioned cattle carry more fat. That fat acts as an insulation, so maybe in the winter that might be okay, but in the summer that's making it harder for them. We talked a little bit about hide color yesterday already, and then breed type, right? We know that some of our Bos Indicus influenced breeds, things like Brangus or Brangus crosses, may be a little more tolerant to heat stress than our traditional breeds. So what are some options for providing shade for cattle? So really that gets down into two areas, so shade, natural shade and artificial shade. Natural shade being provided by trees or wooded areas. Artificial or man-made shade would be some type of permanent or portable shade structure. This is just some guidelines for how much area is required of shade per head. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind, right? Because they do require a little bit more shade than we might think, 30 square foot for a mature cow. And so as you're kind of thinking that, oh, I've got a tree in my pasture, I'm fine, let's do some thinking about how much shade that's actually providing. The other thing is height, and that's just to give them room to come in there. Natural shade options, cattle likely prefer natural shade over artificial shade. Given the opportunity to have both, they're probably going to go towards the natural shade. But when they congregate under these trees over time, they could cause severe damage and tree death. And you see that in both of these pictures here. So that's where rotational grazing can really help, where they're not just having access to that same exact tree for 2 or 3 months at a time. Making sure that we're able to move them around and that we do have adequate shade in each of those paddocks. Avoid fencing them out of the shade if possible. So as those of us from Princeton have alluded to, we had a tornado a few years ago. And that left us with replacing 9 linear miles of fence. And I had I wanted to make sure that when they ran that new fence, that we didn't allow them full access to some of the wooded areas, but we did at least come in a little bit and allow cattle access to those tree lines. And that was something that was important, that we didn't totally fence them out of all of the tree lines. We can plant trees, right? That's we always say that the best time to plant a tree was probably 20 years ago, but the second best time would be now. So thinking about planting some different tree options, pay attention and kind of look at your farm. Where are some areas where you really could utilize more shade? Avoid planting or creating shade areas near riparian areas to limit runoff, because if you think about those animals are going to congregate in those areas, we want to try to keep them out of there if possible. Pay attention to where your waterers are. So Dr. Limcooler yesterday talked about the 800 feet rule. That kind of becomes really important. We also want to make sure that shade is within 800 feet of that water, so that way they're able to come and go from the water as they need, and the whole herd doesn't necessarily have to get up and travel, and they can stay under the trees if they need to. Just some potential different options there on shade types or tree types there. Silvopastures, I kind of call this the ultimate in natural shade. And that is this idea that we're deliberately integrating trees and grazing livestock on the same land. It's a systems approach that allows us to have a livestock enterprise as well as a agroforestry enterprise, where we manage both the forest and the livestock with forage in that system. There is debate within the silvopasture world about whether planting trees into an existing forage area is better, or do you go in to an existing stand of trees and thin those out. Both are options, but neither one's really a super quick solution. But this is kind of a long-term commitment to a pretty productive forage and shade production system. So it's something that is, if it's something that's of interest, certainly reach out. There's a lot of good resources on developing those systems. So artificial shade solutions. So switching gears a little bit, now we're going to talk about some of those shade structures. There's some of those that may be more permanent than others. As you all were driving into the farm yesterday, over on the right-hand side, you probably saw the large shade structure that's out there that's a little more permanent. Then over in that grazing area, we saw one that was a little bit more portable. One thing to think about is that windbreaks can also function as a shade, depending on placement and where you put those. So there's some plans out there for some simple windbreaks for cattle. And if those are tall enough, they will also provide some shade, depending on the time of day. And cattle seem to really like those. We had one at the research station that the tornado took out, and I know prior to that, the cattle like to kind of congregate right there around that windbreak, and it did provide some shade during parts of the day as well. When it comes to portable shade structures, there's a lot of different options. Cost is going to be a big thing to consider. They can range widely in cost. The other one is size, matching the size of your shade structure and making sure that you have enough of them for the number of animals that you have in your group, and that goes back to that square footage of shade. The weight of the structure itself, if it's going to be portable, how easy is it to move? And then how sturdy is it? How well is it going to hold up? Most of those, the ones that you saw out there at out at the farm yesterday, those do hold up pretty well to most of our normal thunderstorms and storm activity. I can tell you they do not withstand EF4 tornadoes. We learned that in Princeton. But for most of our standard weather, they do hold up pretty well. So there's several different options on these metal frames and shade cloth. And Dr. Teutsch, I need to update this with your newest version. But Dr. Teutsch had some like these remade after the tornado, where he actually added, they're on wheels, so you can actually hook them up and tow them behind a vehicle, and it makes it a little bit easier to move them around the property. But there is it's probably in your notebook. If not, you can find it online. There are plans to make these or have them made. Chris, the kind of fancier ones with the wheels, we had those done for what, $3,500?
Yeah, they're about $3,500.
Okay, yeah. So there's options.
There are some plans
in the book. Good.
The Shade Haven that's a little bit bigger than the other ones were around $16,000.
Yeah. Yeah, so these start to get into the $16,000, $20,000 range, and then some. So, and some of those, like this one, is on a wheeled system, so it's very easy to move around. This one is a little bit more permanent, where we've got it posted there. So really kind of doing some thinking, just like we talked about with the watering systems, thinking about if you do need artificial shade, where can you get the best use out of that? So we want to make sure that the top of those structures is relatively flat, so that we minimize the wind load on those. We want to anchor the four corners of the shade with tie downs and use at least an 80% light reduction shade cloth. So those cloths that go on top, they come in kind of varying degrees of how much light they block out. So keep that in mind. These are some options of some homemade ones that you can find online and that people have made. So there's if you get looking, there's several different creative options out there. Pros to these, they're portable. For me, one of the cons is, again, how much shade they actually provide. The height of them, some of them are quite a bit lower, which from the cattle standpoint, we aren't getting the same airflow under there. Again, I put these up here just as maybe some inspiration if you all are interested in creating your own options. The other thing to think about is where we place it in our pasture. So we want to orient the longest side of it north to south to maximize the amount of shade, and it'll allow sunlight to dry that area underneath. Because you'll find very quickly that once cattle start hanging out under there, that area kind of becomes a bit of a mud hole because they're hanging out there all day, they're urinating, they're defecating. So making sure that we're able to maximize that amount of sunlight during parts of the day to dry that area is also helpful. We want to keep it at least 50 feet away from large structures so that we don't limit airflow, and avoid placing it right next to the water source. And the reason for that is they got, and I say right next, but then I also say within 800 feet just to give them some areas to move around. We want to promote forage utilization and prevent overgrazing in those loafing areas. So if we put shade, water, mineral, all right next to each other, they aren't going anywhere all day, right? They're going to hang out right there the whole day. If we put it a little bit further apart, we can get them to get some grazing in there. So this is a website I've used, mapdevelopers.com. You can actually go in. It's a free website. You can go in and put a point on the map of your farm and actually put a radius out there. So this is either an 800 or 1,200 feet radius. I can't remember which one it is. And so I like this a lot when you're trying to think about planning your grazing systems and maybe where you might want to put water, and then also looking to say, hey, where do I have shade? Where do I don't? Where do I not have shade? So this is an example. This is actually at the research station. And so right now the water for this field's right here. There's some natural, like a spring over here as well. But most of the water access is right here. So maybe ideally I want it more in the middle because I could break that then into 4 paddocks instead of one large 40-acre field. And prior to the tornado, I had a really nice clump of trees right there. So I would have actually had shade in 3 of those 4 areas. And really, I'd only need to address shade needs for this part of that field, and I would have water in the middle. So again, that mapdevelopers.com is a simple, easy tool and kind of lets you see what 800 or 1,200 feet looks like, and can really help you plan out your watering and your shading options. So this is some data we collected last year looking in late August. And we put these little temperature data loggers out. And I put one under a shade tree, so that's that green area there. One just on a fenced post, so that would have been out in the sun. And then one under a shade cloth. And so you can see in the hottest part of the day, that temperature was certainly lower in those shaded areas, and actually even a little bit lower in the shade cloth, under the shade cloth versus under the shade tree that we put it on. But keep in mind, too, that this was stationary, and so as that sunlight kind of came through, these weren't really moving around like the cattle might. So these may have gotten exposed to a little more direct sunlight than what the cattle would have, because they would have likely gotten up and moved out of the sun. But I just wanted to kind of show you that as an example, that shade really does work to create that cooling effect. So, and then we see kind of a big difference here between 92, 100, and 108 degrees. So we've cooled that off by over 10 degrees by just putting them in the shade. So take-home points for this: shade is absolutely critical, especially in those hot times of the year. is second to water, but it is right up there in terms of a need for our livestock and something we need to think about in our grazing systems. Take advantage of what you do have, and then plan for improvements. So take advantage of the natural shade that you already have, but certainly take some time to consider strategic tree plantings, and then some shade structures, especially if you're on any kind of leased ground or something like that. That's where those portable structures might come kind of in handy, because you can take them and take them with you when you go. Develop the grazing system so it optimizes the use of natural shade in the summer months. So really think about that. If you're thinking about maybe putting in some summer annuals or some warm season grasses where you're going to be having some more grazing in the summer months, make sure we've really got some good shade options in those fields in particular. And lastly, heat stress is unavoidable. All of our cattle and all of our livestock are going to encounter heat stress at some point, but we can certainly work to improve animal welfare and at the same time animal performance during those severe heat stress events by making sure they have shade, adjusting things like feeding time, making sure that we're not out moving them, that we're not moving them from paddock to paddock in a rotational system, or we're not getting them up to work them in the hot part of the days, or even if it's going to be hot at all, we try to avoid that as much as possible with some proper planning. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that you guys might have. Yep. Oh, look at you. Not a general rule of thumb. I think the biggest thing is, if we're talking about existing trees, making sure that in a good rotational system, if we think about one of the advantages of rotational grazing is that our forages get a rest at the same time those trees would get a rest as well. Also thinking about having, planting multiple trees so that we've got trees coming up in the system over the next several years. I know that's more of a long-term outlook on that, but certainly if we know we've got existing trees that are damaged today, we really need to make sure we're getting trees planted for the future. So not a hard and fast rule, but I think that piece of rotational grazing, you can also allow the trees to have some rest as well, and that starts to minimize some of the erosion around the base of those trees.
I was wondering, what I was saying is, if you maintain the grass or
Yeah, right, and that's where that rest comes in. Certainly, it's because what you'll see is they're all hanging out there. You actually start to see erosion. The roots of the tree become more visible, and that's really when you start to see the trees start to die off, and then in a few years will be completely gone. So, yeah.
Some of those at the research station, the large paddocks that are fairly large trees, but I mean they've just been
Yep.
really decimated.
And some of those are in research paddocks where they're designed to be stocked and not rotationally grazed. And do as we say, not as we do. So, yep. Good question. I know that they may be a little more sensitive to heat, and certainly depending on how much wool or hair cover they have on them can impact heat stress. I think small ruminants tend to be a little more sensitive in nature anyways, and so that, yeah, they probably do show signs and symptoms more quickly than the cattle do.